They say there's a man who walks the earth but leaves no trace. He appears in deserts, on ships lost at sea, in dreams and visions too vivid to forget. He offers no name, yet his presence changes everything. He teaches without words, corrects without explanation, and vanishes before you understand what just happened. The Qur'an mentions him, but only vaguely. He's not a prophet, yet prophets sought him. He's not an angel, yet he knows things no man should know. He walks not with time, but through it. This is the tale of the man known only by a color, Khidr, the one who lives outside the limits of life itself. They spoke of a stranger whose feet touched no dust, whose scent left no trace, whose voice echoed long after he vanished. Not because of the words he spoke, but because of what changed inside the one who heard them. There were no scrolls written about him, no grand lineages traced back to a noble tribe. He did not wear the garb of royalty nor sit among scholars in public courts. And yet, the weight of his silence was heavier than volumes of eloquent speech. People don't remember his face. They remember the moment, a boat that should have sunk but didn't, a child who was saved from becoming a tyrant, though no one understood at the time, a wall rebuilt in a forgotten town that later revealed a treasure meant for orphans. Strange events that made no sense until years later, when the truth unfolded like a hidden page turning in the book of destiny. That was his way. Acting upon knowledge that didn't come from books, but from the divine. His name was not spoken aloud in most places. When it was said softly, like a secret not meant for common ears. Khidr, the green one, the one who lives when others die, who walks while others sleep. Some claimed he was once a man like any other, born, aged, traveled. But at some point he drank from the water of life, Ma'ul Hayat, and since then he has not been touched by death. Not because he is immortal, but because Allah has withheld his end. For now, he doesn't age. His clothes never seem to wear. And though centuries pass, he appears always the same, serene, composed, cloaked in a quiet that unsettles the soul. He doesn't introduce himself. He arrives when he is needed, not when he is expected. And when he speaks, it feels as if time halts just to listen. His words are few, but each syllable cuts like a blade into false certainty. He is neither in the past nor the future. He is simply present. Some say he was seen during the time of Nuh, helping those who clung to faith. Others claim he walked among the armies of Talut, standing silently as the Dawood stepped forward to face Goliath. There are whispers that he stood at the edge of the Red Sea when it split from Musa, and that he witnessed the kingdom of Suleiman rise and fall. But no one can say for sure. That's the paradox. He is always seen but never captured, always felt but never confirmed. Even the prophets spoke of him. Even Musa, the mighty messenger who spoke to Allah directly, was once told, "There is a servant of mine who knows what you do not." Musa set out to find him, to sit at his feet, to learn. But what he found wasn't a man with scrolls or sermons. He found a being who acted on knowledge that tore at the fabric of logic and morality. A boat sabotaged, a boy killed, a wall built for a town that didn't deserve it. And each time Musa objected, he was reminded, "You cannot bear what I know." That was the lesson. Khidr was not here to be understood. He was here to obey. In our world of systems and labels, where everything must fit into neat categories, he is the anomaly. Not a prophet, not a saint, not quite human anymore. He is a servant. Abd min ibadina, a servant from among our servants. And that title, simple as it is, holds more weight than any earthly crown. There have been stories. A man lost in the desert who was guided to water by a silent companion. A woman who, at her lowest point, was pulled back from despair by a stranger who vanished before she could thank him. A child who heard a voice in a dream that prevented a deadly accident the next day. These moments are rare, but when they come, they leave no doubt. Someone is watching. Not to control, but to redirect. Not to dominate, but to protect. He does not belong to any nation, sect, or ideology. He does not boast miracles, though his presence bends reality. His allegiance is not to men or governments, but to the one who sent him. And that is why no one controls him. No one predicted him. He appears when the decree descends and leaves when his task is complete. People say, meet him, you won't realize it until he's gone. And even then you'll question whether he was real, because that's how Al-Khidr moves, like a breeze in the night, seen only by those whose hearts are prepared. And if you ever ask where he is now, the answer will always be the same: wherever Allah has willed. He was young, yet carried the bearing of one who had seen the stars fade and return again. The boy's name was Musa, a prophet whose heart burned with a yearning not just for truth, but for the wisdom behind it. Revelation had shaped his path, and miracles had marked his mission. Water sprung from stone, a staff that split the sea, and the tyrant Pharaoh reduced to silence beneath waves. Yet even after speaking to Allah directly at Sinai, there lingered within Musa a question that stirred restlessly in his soul. Is there anyone more knowledgeable than me? He asked, not in arrogance, but in pursuit. The answer came not as a rebuke, but as a divine redirection. Yes, a servant of mine possesses knowledge that you do not. Musa's heart surged. Who was this servant? What could he possibly know that a prophet did not? It was not jealousy, it was hunger, the kind only fed by proximity to the divine. And so he set off, accompanied by a young servant named Yusha, with a fish as their sign. Where the fish came to life and slipped into the sea, that would be the place where destiny and mystery would meet. Days passed. The journey was harsh, and time seemed to stretch unnaturally. Then it happened. While resting near a rock, Yusha saw the fish leap from their provisions and vanish into the water. He watched in silence, frozen by awe and confusion, unsure if it had been real. Only later, when Musa asked about the fish, did realization dawn upon them both. They turned back, retraced their steps, and there at the convergence of two seas they found him. He was seated, calm as the sea before a storm, robed in garments that neither wind nor sand had touched. His eyes held the depth of oceans and the stillness of ancient mountains. Musa approached, respectfully but directly. May I follow you so that you may teach me something of the guidance you have been taught? The stranger looked upon him, not with judgment, but with a knowing that went deeper than words. Indeed, you will not be able to bear with me, he replied. I will be patient, if Allah wills, Musa answered, the fire of sincerity burning in his chest. And so it began, not a lesson in words, but a trial of perception. The prophet would follow the servant, but what he would witness was not meant to soothe. It was meant to shatter the illusions of justice, wisdom, and even mercy as men define them. The sea whispered nearby. The winds carried no answers. But somewhere in that quiet, the greatest of mysteries was about to unfold, not in the heavens, but on the road, step by step. They stepped onto a weathered boat that rocked gently with the tide. The crew, humble fishermen, welcomed them without suspicion. Salt clung to their beards, and the air tasted of the sea and long labor. The boat, though old, was their livelihood, patched and mended with care. Musa observed quietly, his prophetic heart sensitive to the rhythms of the people, the sea, and the strange companion he now followed. Then it happened. Without hesitation or explanation, the man, this servant of Allah, walked to the side of the boat and began removing planks from the hull. His fingers moved with practiced ease, exposing the vulnerable underbelly of the vessel. Water began to seep in, a slow, deliberate sabotage. Musa stood in shock, unable to hold his tongue. "Have you scuttled it to drown its people? You have done a terrible thing." The man did not look up, nor defend himself with logic or protest. He simply said, "Did I not tell you that you could not bear with me?" Musa, flustered by the horror of what he had seen, softened. "Do not blame me for what I forgot. Do not make my path hard for me." And so they continued. But Musa's heart was restless. His mind circled the image of the boat, the betrayal it felt like, the innocent men who had shown them kindness. He could not understand. How could a man of divine knowledge, one who claimed closeness to Allah, commit an act that so clearly harmed those who did no wrong? He tried to silence the question within, tried to tell himself there must be wisdom behind it. But the image would not fade. The boat rocking, the boards were removed. The quiet guilt in the fishermen's eyes when they discovered the damage, unaware that they were being saved from a greater loss yet to come. The sea stretched ahead, endless. The man walked beside him in silence, unaffected by judgment. He seemed not to belong to the same reality. His steps too firm, his gaze too still. Musa realized he was not just following a man, he was trailing the footprints of divine decree before it became visible to the eyes of men. Still the unease lingered. The lesson had begun, but understanding had not yet arrived. The sun stood high as they entered the outskirts of a village nestled between two stony hills. Children played in dusty alleyways. Men eyed them suspiciously from doorways. Women drew their veils tighter. There was no welcome here. The strangers walked unacknowledged and unfed, their presence neither celebrated nor cursed, only ignored. Hunger crept into their bones, yet they were offered nothing. Musa's stomach growled, but pride kept him silent. His companion showed no complaint. Instead, he turned his eyes to the crumbling wall of an old house. It leaned precariously as if waiting for the earth's next breath to collapse. Without a word, the man stepped forward and began repairing it. Stone by stone, he rebuilt the wall, his fingers nimble, his efforts steady. Musa watched, perplexed. This was a town that had shown no hospitality, not even water. Yet here was a man giving time, energy, and skill to preserve part of their forgotten history. Musa's brow furrowed. "If you had wished," he said, trying to suppress his frustration, "you could have taken payment for this." The servant turned to him once more, but this time there was finality in his gaze. "This is the parting between you and me," he said calmly. The words dropped like iron. This wasn't a punishment, it was fulfillment. Musa had agreed not to question. 3 times he did, and now the path has ended. But the servant's mercy was still present. Before departing, he spoke, each word peeling back the layers of divine wisdom Musa had tried to grasp. The boat? It belonged to poor fishermen. Ahead lay a tyrant king who seized every good ship by force. By damaging the boat, he preserved their livelihood. The boy? He would grow to spread tyranny and disbelief, breaking the hearts of righteous parents. Allah would replace him with a better soul. The wall? Beneath it was a treasure left for orphans by their father, a righteous man. Had it collapsed now, the treasure would be lost before the boys came of age. Every act, once seen as cruelty or injustice, now shimmered with divine mercy. Musa was silent, overwhelmed. not by the complexity, but by the simplicity of what he hadn't seen. This man didn't act on whim nor impulse. He moved with divine instruction, not seeking approval or clarity from the world. And as he turned and walked away, Musa was left not with shame, but with awe. For the first time he understood, some truths are not spoken, they are alive. The tale of Musa and the enigmatic man who bore the hidden knowledge had ended with their parting, but the ripples of that encounter echoed far into realms unseen. Yet that man, who the scholars call Khidr, did not vanish into obscurity. For he was not bound by time as others were, nor tethered to place. Where Musa saw the surface of events, Khidr walked their roots. His journey continued beyond what the eye could trace, and the veil of this world often shifted as he moved, where cause and effect surrendered to divine decree. Long before he met Musa, Khidr had walked among the ruins of civilizations forgotten by men and recorded by angels. He had seen empires rise with the arrogance of permanence and crumble beneath the weight of their own pride. He had spoken to the trees that remembered the footsteps of Noah and once stood in the place where the ark had settled after the flood had receded. To the untrained eye, he seemed like a traveler, a silent man of nature. But to those attuned to the divine, his very presence whispered of realms beyond this one. In one such forgotten land, the soil was dry and the people were bitter. Their king, draped in gold and perfumes, ruled with injustice wrapped in the pretense of order. The poor starved in silence, the widows wept unseen, and the orphans were treated as burdens. Khidr entered the city as a stranger. No one noticed him, and yet every soul that passed by him felt an unexplainable pause in their heart. He observed quietly as beggars were lashed for asking for bread, as scholars were mocked for speaking truth, and as the masjid was turned into a place for royal display rather than remembrance. He walked through a narrow alley where a blind man sat, hands trembling as he recited verses of Revelation. The blind man, once a teacher of knowledge, had been silenced by the king for teaching that wealth is a trust and power is a test. Khidr sat beside him without a word. The man stopped his recitation, turning his sightless face toward him. "I know who you are," he whispered, lips trembling. "They said you were a legend, but I can feel your presence. You are the one who walks where the decree walks." Khidr placed his hand gently on the man's shoulder. No words were exchanged, but when he stood and walked away, the blind man's eyes opened for the first time in 20 years. He blinked at the sunlight and wept, not for the miracle, but for the mercy it signified. Later that night, Khidr stood before the palace gates. The guards saw nothing unusual, just a quiet man cloaked in shadow. He passed them without resistance, as if they were rooted in place, unable to move or speak. Within the palace, the king sat drunk with indulgence, surrounded by sycophants who laughed at every word he spoke. Khidr entered the great hall and stood silently at its center. The torches flickered. The king looked upon him and scoffed. "Who are you? Will another mystic come to tell me tales?" Khidr raised his hand and the room fell silent, not by force but by awe. The very air seemed to halt in its path. "You were given power as a test," he said, "but you made yourself a good among men." The king laughed bitterly. "And what will you do? Curse me with riddles?" But as he spoke, his crown fell from his head. The stone beneath his throne cracked. The wine turned to dust in his cup. Fear gripped him for the first time. Khidr turned and walked away. That night, the earth quaked and a fire spread through the palace. By dawn, the city's people emerged to find the tyrant gone, and the blind teacher standing in the masjid, reciting verses once again. Khidr was already far away. In another corner of the world, beyond the boundaries of known kingdoms, where rivers flowed with the shimmer of moonlight and deserts sang in the wind, Khidr encountered a people forgotten by the historians of earth, but remembered by the scrolls of heaven. These were the descendants of travelers who had once followed the guidance of prophets long past. They lived in simplicity, but not in ignorance. They preserved wisdom through songs, and their children could recite parables older than pyramids. Yet their peace was threatened by a neighboring warlord who sought to enslave their men and take their women. He had already sent scouts into their valleys, and the sound of his iron-chained army approached with each passing moon. The people gathered and prayed, uncertain of how to defend themselves without weapons or might. Khidr appeared among them like a traveler seeking shelter. He listened. He ate with them. He asked no questions, yet knew the answers. One night, as the village elders debated fleeing, a child came running from the hills, claiming he saw a man speaking to the river. They laughed nervously, but the child swore by the stars. Khidr was there, kneeling by the riverbed, his hands dipped into the current. The next morning, the river was gone, dry, as if it had never existed. Panic set in. The warlord's army was days away, and now the only water source had vanished. The villagers feared death, but Khidr simply said, "You will not thirst." And they did not. When the army arrived, they found their horses collapsing from thirst. Their soldiers, fatigued and delirious, turned on each other in confusion. They sought water, but every path led to dryness. Some claimed to see green pastures just beyond the hills, illusions that led them in circles. Within 3 days, the warlord's forces were broken, scattered by their own desperation. Then the river returned. The villagers wept, not in fear this time, but in gratitude. Khidr left in silence once more. But from that day on, their songs included a new verse about the man who spoke to rivers, whose presence was both warning and mercy. There was a city built on pride, a metropolis of scholars who believed they had mastered all that needed mastering. They dissected the stars, counted the winds, named every root of every herb. They wrote volumes on philosophy, debated fate until their tongues bled, and dismissed the prophets as primitive storytellers. Among them arose a man of unparalleled knowledge who declared that there were no secrets left in the world. He mocked the idea of unseen beings and dismissed revelation as the dream of the weak-minded. Khidr arrived in this city as a beggar, his robes dusty, his face lined with age. He listened to their lectures, sat in their grand halls, and watched their arrogant debates. Then one day, during a great assembly attended by kings and scientists alike, he rose and said, "I have a question." The scholars looked at him with disdain. "Speak, old man." Khidr asked, "What is the sound of a soul breaking?" They laughed. "That is not a scientific question." He asked again, "What is the measure of a tear from a mother who buries her child?" They called him mad, so he raised his hand, and they saw things they could not describe. Equations turned into birds. The sky above cracked open and showed stars none had ever charted. Their instruments failed. Their language faltered. Their minds, built on logic alone, could not bear what he had opened for mere seconds. And then all returned to normal. But none of them could speak. Not for days. The man who once denied the unseen now whispered prayers at night. The city changed. Humility returned. A masjid was built where once there was a shrine to intellect alone. Khidr had walked among them not to mock knowledge, but to remind them that true knowledge begins with submission. In a village afflicted by drought, where the earth cracked and children died young, a woman prayed every night beside a well that held no water. Her husband had perished seeking rain. Her sons had gone to foreign land, She remained old and weary, tending to the graves of her ancestors, whispering prayers she learned as a girl. Khidr came to her in the heat of a summer day asking for water. She smiled bitterly. "You may have the dust." But he simply said, "May I sit and pray beside you?" She nodded. That night, clouds formed over a sky that had not seen rain in 10 years. Rain came, slow at first, then strong. The land drank deeply. In the morning she found Khidr gone, but beside the well there bloomed a flower never before seen in those lands. Her grandchildren would return years later to find the village green again, and they would hear of the man who asked only to sit and pray. The well never dried again. The seas were calm that evening as the sun dipped below the horizon, bleeding its colors into the water, turning it into a canvas of gold and red. Fishermen hauled their nets onto wooden boats, seagulls cried in the distance, and coastal children played barefoot in the wet sand. In this small fishing town, where life moved in rhythm with the tides, there was a legend passed from one generation to another of a green-robed man who once walked across the water, whose footsteps left no ripple. They did not know his name, only that he came when prayers became sighs and when despair knocked on doors. That evening, as the village gathered for the communal breaking of the fast, a figure appeared from the shadows. He was cloaked in a garment dyed with the deep hue of forest moss, and his eyes shimmered with the calmness of someone who had seen what lay beyond the veil of the world. He said nothing. He simply walked to the edge of the beach and stood still as the waves lapped against his feet. They watched in silence. A young boy, the orphan of a sailor lost to a storm, approached the man. In his hand, he held a cracked compass, all that remained of his father. "They say you're the one who speaks to the sea," the boy said. "Can you bring my father back?" The man kneeled, placing his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Your father is not lost," he said. "He has merely returned to the shore of his origin. You too will sail one day." That night the sea roared. A storm unlike any in the memory of that town swept over the coast. Boats were torn from their moorings, homes were flooded, and the people cried out in fear. But the stranger was seen walking calmly amidst the chaos, touching walls, guiding animals to high ground, whispering to the wind. Where his foot touched the earth, the water retreated. When he pointed, trees bent and shielded those beneath him. The people later swore they saw the lightning halt in the sky as if awaiting his leave. When dawn broke, the village lay bruised but not broken. No lives were lost, and when they searched for the man, they found only his footprints, a perfect path leading from the ocean to the highest rock above the beach. There on the stone sat the boy's compass, whole again, its needle spinning slowly before it stilled and pointed inland. Years later, that boy would become a navigator of great renown, leading ships through the most treacherous waters with an uncanny instinct. He always wore that compass and often whispered to it before each voyage. He never told anyone what it whispered back. Far from the oceans, hidden in the folds of a desert where the sand could whisper secrets and the wind carried forgotten names, a caravan wandered off course. They were merchants and travelers, bound for a market across the border, but a sudden storm had swallowed the landmarks and turned the stars into haze. Days passed, water ran low, morale waned. Some began to dig into the sand, hoping to find old wells, while others collapsed in prayer, their voices hoarse and dry. It was in the silence of the fourth night that they saw him, a man seated atop a dune, staring into the stars as if reading verses etched into the sky. They approached hesitantly. "Are you real?" asked one of the caravan men. The man stood and nodded. "You are lost, but not forsaken." They begged him for direction, for guidance. He said only, "Follow me." And so they did. He led them not along any road, but between windswept paths where even the camels hesitated. They passed stone monoliths buried by time, heard whispers in the dunes that spoke of ancient prophets, and saw visions in the heat mirage of civilizations buried beneath the sand. The stranger never ate, never drank, and never slept. When they awoke, he was already walking. When they wept, he stood by them with silent patience. On the seventh day, he halted at a mound of earth that looked no different from the hundreds they had passed. He knelt, placed his hand into the sand, and pulled forth a smooth stone inscribed with symbols none of them could read. "This," he said, "is where your ancestor once prayed for rain." He pressed the stone back into the sand, and then the rain came. Not a storm, but a steady, cleansing rain that darkened the dunes and opened a spring that had not flowed in centuries. Birds appeared from the sky, camels drank deeply, the caravan rejoiced, and when they turned to thank him, he was gone. But one of them, a scribe, wrote of it in a leather-bound journal, recording not only the rain, but the name he whispered before the stranger vanished: Al-Khidr. The mountains of the north were bitter with snow, and the people who dwelled there were hardened by survival. Among them lived a blacksmith who had lost his son in an avalanche many winters ago. Since that day, he had forged tools but never smiled, his face always shadowed by grief. He believed no prayer could bring his son back. No warmth could melt the glacier in his heart. It was during a particularly harsh winter that a traveler arrived, clad not in furs or wool, but in a green garment that remained unstained by snow. He came to the smithy and placed a blade on the anvil. "Sharpen this," he said. The blacksmith glanced at it. It was ancient, a sword not meant for war, but for ceremony, inscribed with symbols he had never seen. As he worked, the stranger spoke of grief, of fathers who lost sons, of sons who became martyrs in the eyes of heaven. Grief, he said, is not a sign of weakness, but of connection. Would you rather never have loved at all? The blacksmith's hands trembled. That night, the village was struck by a blizzard so fierce that even the hearths inside homes began to falter. Yet the stranger walked into the storm, lifting the sword to the sky. They said the winds parted, that a path opened between the mountains, and through that path walked a boy, his clothes torn, frost clinging to his lashes, but alive. It was the blacksmith's son, rescued, sheltered by a bear's den, and guided out by dreams of a man in green who told him to follow the stars. The stranger was never seen again, but the blacksmith rebuilt his forge, not for swords, but for instruments of peace. The sword remained on the wall, untouched, its edge glowing faintly in the firelight. In the heart of a city plagued by corruption and decay, where even the azan was drowned by market noise and minarets, stood more for show than for remembrance, a young man cried out in anguish. He was an imam's son, raised with verses, but surrounded by vice. He tried to lead prayers, but the people mocked him, tried to teach the youth, but they laughed and turned to the world's glitter. He began to question if his dawah mattered at all. "Oh Allah, he cried one night, "send me a sign or hike me from this place." That very night, an old man entered the masjid, walking with a staff of olive wood, eyes that seemed to hold the dawn itself. He listened to the young man's recitation, then sat with him under the dome and began to tell stories of prophets who were mocked but kept walking, of angels who wept beside wells in the desert, of deeds small in the eyes of men but mighty with Allah. The young man wept, the old man smiled. The heart is not purified through ease, but through fire, patience, and trust. The next morning the masjid was filled, not with noise but with sincerity, for something had shifted. The city stirred, and in the years that followed, that young man became the revivalist of his time, not because of eloquence, but because of sincerity. He often spoke of a night when he met a man whose name he never knew, but whose words pierced like divine light. Some say the man was Khidr, others say he was just a traveler. But those who knew the taste of the unseen understood. He had been a servant of the most merciful, sent as a whisper of guidance, a shadow of the eternal decree.